All right, buckle up, because we're diving into a theory that suggests history might be a lot more, well, dramatic than we think. We're talking about the work of Dr. Chan Thomas and his book, The Adam and Eve Story.
Mhm.
And get this, the CIA actually kept this book classified for years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, pretty intriguing, right? So we're going off of a YouTube video that breaks down Dr. Thomas' ideas. And our mission today, we're going to see if his claims actually hold any water, so to speak, scientifically. We're going to start by painting the picture that Dr. Thomas lays out. And let me tell you, it's a wild one. Then we'll take a look at the evidence and see if it holds up, to scrutiny.
Oh,
So are you ready?
absolutely. Let's do it.
All right, let's jump in. So first things first, who is this Dr. Chan Thomas guy? Well, he was an electrical engineer, worked for some big-name companies like McDonnell Douglas, even dabbled in UFOs. But it was his book, published in 1966, that really raised some eyebrows.
Mm.
His main idea is that the Earth goes through these, cyclical and catastrophic pole shifts.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not talking about the magnetic poles slowly drifting a bit. I mean, picture this. The Earth's crust actually shifting, continents moving rapidly, reshaping the entire planet, like overnight.
Whoa, hold on. That sounds intense.
Oh, it gets even crazier. See, Dr. Thomas, he doesn't just say this happened once. He claims it's happened multiple times, wiping out entire civilizations, forcing humanity to, hit the reset button and start from scratch.
So like a whole cyclical cataclysm thing that really challenges, our conventional understanding of history.
Exactly. It's like
Yeah.
suggesting that civilizations might have risen and fallen countless times before us, and we have no idea. Pretty mind-blowing, right?
Totally, yeah.
So how does Dr. Thomas envision this whole thing going down? Okay, get this. The Earth's crust basically liquefies, which allows these giant landmasses to just drift around. Now, the oceans and atmosphere are still spinning, right? At over 1,000 miles per hour. And they slam into these suddenly stationary landmasses. So we're talking winds faster than the speed of sound, tsunamis miles high, just absolute chaos.
Wow, it's like something out of a disaster movie.
Right. And then, almost instantly, temperatures plummet, everything flash freezes, cities vanish, forests turn to ice, humanity is basically thrown back to the Stone Age.
It's a scenario that definitely grabs your attention. But, while the imagery is vivid, the scientific community, well, they're a bit divided on this whole rapid pole shift theory. You see, the concept was first proposed by a guy named Charles Hapgood back in the 1950s. And while his work on continental drift is now widely accepted, this rapid shift idea is still, well, it's highly debated, to say the least.
Okay, so maybe not everyone's buying into the science just yet. But what about all those ancient flood myths we hear about? Almost every culture around the world has stories about a devastating flood that, wiped out civilization. Could these be echoes of a real pole shift event? What do you think?
One potential connection that comes to mind is the Younger Dryas event, which happened around 11,500 years ago. It was a period of sudden, and I mean dramatic, climate change. And there's evidence of, massive flooding happening around that time. Could this be a clue to a previous pole shift?
The Younger Dryas event is definitely interesting. Think of the Earth like a peach, okay? The skin is the Earth's crust, the part we live on. Then there's the fleshy part, which is called the mantle, and that's mostly solid, but there's this, gooey layer deep inside.
I'm picturing it.
Now, there's growing evidence of some serious flooding happening around the Younger Dryas, but the cause is still a mystery. Some scientists think it was a comet impact. Others believe it was related to, natural ocean currents or maybe melting glaciers. So, the Younger Dryas is still a puzzle. But what about civilizations that might be even older? Civilizations that might have been wiped out by even earlier pole shifts. That's where things get really interesting. For example, the erosion patterns at the base of the Sphinx, they suggest it was exposed to, huge amounts of water, possibly before the last known flood, which was about 6,500 years ago. Could the Sphinx be much older than we think?
That's a good question.
And then there's the legend of Atlantis, right? A technologically advanced civilization that was swallowed by the sea. Some researchers believe that the rigid structure in the Sahara Desert, the Eye of the Sahara, some believe that could be the remains of Atlantis.
Oh, wow, I've heard of that.
And let's not forget about the Land of Mu, this hypothetical lost continent in the Pacific. People often point to the structures of Nan Madol in Micronesia, those mysterious Easter Island statues, as potential evidence of this, like sunken civilization.
It's amazing to think about how much we still don't know about our planet's history.
Right. And you see all these similarities between ancient cultures, like the Greeks, Egyptians, even Polynesian cultures.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if they had a shared origin, some connection to a lost civilization, maybe.
It definitely sparks the imagination, but it's important to remember that we're in the realm of speculation here. The scientific evidence for these lost civilizations and their connection to pole shifts, it's still very thin. But you know what? It's definitely an area that needs more investigation, for sure.
Absolutely, I agree. Okay, so we've got these ancient myths and some, well, pretty intriguing archaeological anomalies. But how does Dr. Thomas actually explain how a pole shift happens? Like, how does the Earth physically flip on its axis? He goes really deep into the Earth's structure, focusing on that gooey layer in the mantle about 60 miles down. He suggests that disruptions in the Earth's magnetic and electric fields cause this layer to become even more fluid, almost like a lubricant for the crust above it.
So the crust is kind of floating on this, like, slippery layer.
Exactly. And then he says the weight of the ice caps at the poles acts like a giant lever, pulling on the crust, causing it to rapidly shift. The result? Well, a catastrophic pole shift, continents rearranging, and the world as we know it, totally transformed.
Okay, I see where he's going with this, but it sounds like he's making some big assumptions about how these systems interact.
He definitely is.
And, while he's using real scientific concepts like the Earth's molten core and the magnetic field, his theory about the ice caps actually triggering a sudden pole shift, that's where a lot of scientists disagree.
Yeah, that seems to be a major point of contention.
Because the current scientific understanding is that, pole shifts happen gradually over very long periods. We're talking thousands, even millions of years. This idea of a sudden catastrophic shift within days, like Dr. Thomas describes, it just doesn't line up with most of the geological evidence we have.
It's fascinating how he blends these scientific concepts with ideas that, well, let's just say they're a bit outside the mainstream. Like, you know how he shifted his focus later on to things like ESP and UFOs.
Yeah, it's quite a range of interests.
It makes you wonder if maybe his research into pole shifts led him down a path towards these, more fringe ideas. It's like he was searching for answers beyond what conventional science could offer.
It definitely adds another layer to his story, but you know what? Let's bring it back to the science for a minute. While a cataclysmic pole shift, like the one Dr. Thomas describes, is, well, highly unlikely, there are some real concerns about the shifting magnetic poles and, increased solar activity we're seeing.
Okay, so maybe we don't need to worry about a sudden apocalyptic pole shift right now. But what about these shifting magnetic poles? What's the reality there?
Well, the reality is that the Earth's magnetic poles do flip periodically. North becomes south, south becomes north. And guess what? We're actually overdue for a flip.
Really?
Yep, we're seeing signs that the magnetic field is weakening, which makes us more vulnerable to solar flares and radiation.
That doesn't sound good.
It's not going to be an extinction level event or anything like that. But a weakened magnetic field, it could definitely disrupt our technology, knock out satellites, even mess with power grids. It wouldn't be the end of the world, but it could definitely disrupt our daily lives in some major ways.
So it sounds like while Dr. Thomas's vision of a sudden apocalyptic pole shift might be a bit far-fetched, there are still some legitimate concerns about the impact of a weakening magnetic field on our modern world. It seems like we've only scratched the surface here. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to this theory. Where do we go from here?
You're right, there is. Dr. Thomas, he doesn't just describe these events, these cataclysmic events. He actually tries to pinpoint, put dates on when these pole shifts actually happened.
Oh, so he's not just throwing out a hypothetical scenario. He's saying these events occurred at specific points in history.
Right, exactly.
What kind of time frame are we talking about here?
Well, he links one pole shift to the Younger Dryas event, around 11,500 years ago, the one we talked about earlier. But he also points to another one, another flood, that supposedly happened around 6,500 years ago. And he says that one wiped out, yet another advanced civilization.
Okay, so he's placing these events within a time frame that overlaps with, like, the emergence of early civilizations. And he's suggesting that these civilizations might have been, well, more advanced than we give them credit for. Is there any evidence to support this idea of a massive flood around 6,500 years ago?
It's interesting you ask that because recent archaeological discoveries, they seem to kind of line up with this time frame. We found evidence of the Chinese Great Flood myth dating back to right around that period, along with signs of some major flooding in the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. And these floods, they all seem to have happened right around the time Dr. Thomas suggests.
Wow, so while Dr. Thomas's theories might be, controversial, his focus on these flood myths, it actually aligns with some recent archaeological discoveries that suggest floods played a pretty significant role in shaping those ancient civilizations. But I'm curious, What kind of evidence does Dr. Thomas use to back up his theory? What led him to these conclusions in the first place?
Well, he draws on a variety of sources, everything from ancient maps and like mysterious geological formations to even those, iconic Easter Island statues. It's like he's piecing together a puzzle using clues from all across history and different disciplines.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So let's break down those clues. What did Dr. Thomas find so compelling?
Okay, well, one piece of the puzzle that he points to is the Piri race map. It's this Turkish map from the 16th century. And what's remarkable about it is that it seems to depict Antarctica, but with coastlines that were, get this, ice-free.
Wait, so Antarctica without ice?
That's what the map seems to show, which has fueled speculation that maybe Antarctica wasn't always covered in ice, and that a pole shift might have moved it to its current, polar position.
So we've got a 16th century map potentially challenging our whole understanding of Antarctica's history.
Yeah.
Pretty mind-blowing. What else stood out to Dr. Thomas?
He also points to those massive, like, wave-like formations you find in certain landscapes, particularly in the Sahara Desert, like giant ripples frozen in time.
I'm trying to picture that.
It's hard to explain those formations unless you imagine a truly colossal flood, like a tsunami, but hundreds of feet high sweeping across the land.
Okay, yeah, that image is hard to shake. It really makes you wonder what kind of forces have been at work throughout Earth's history. What about those Easter Island statues? Where do they fit in?
Ah, the moai. Most people only think about the heads, right? But a lot of those statues, they actually have bodies that are buried deep underground. And Dr. Thomas, he saw this as potential evidence of a sudden event, like a flood or a mudslide that buried them over time.
So these ancient figures, partially submerged, frozen in time by some cataclysmic event. It's a powerful image.
Right. And if we connect these clues back to the bigger picture, the idea that massive floods have reshaped the Earth's surface, it's not totally out there. I mean, we have geological evidence of ancient tsunamis, and even the Grand Canyon is thought to have been carved by a catastrophic flood event.
So maybe these ancient myths and geological formations, they're not just stories and scenery. Maybe they're echoes of real events that, shaped our planet and its history. And speaking of those ancient stories, Dr. Thomas seems really drawn to the idea of those lost continents, Atlantis and Mu. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, we talked about Atlantis earlier and its possible connection to the Eye of the Sahara. But Dr. Thomas, he also explores this idea of Mu, a hypothetical continent in the Pacific. He believes the megalithic structures of Nan Madol in Micronesia and those Easter Island statues, he sees those as remnants of this lost civilization that was swallowed by the sea.
So he's suggesting that entire civilizations, potentially like way more advanced than we imagine, existed in these landmasses that are now, underwater.
That's the idea.
That's a pretty bold claim.
It is. And he goes even further, He draws parallels between the gods and myths of ancient cultures from all over the world. He suggests that these similarities, they point to a single advanced civilization that was wiped out by a previous pole shift. And they left behind, like echoes of their culture in the myths and legends that survived.
It's a captivating idea. The thought that these ancient cultures, separated by, vast distances, might have shared a common origin, a connection to a lost civilization. But is there enough evidence to move this beyond, just speculation?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. While it's definitely fascinating to think about these possibilities, it's important to approach them with, a healthy dose of skepticism. The evidence is largely circumstantial. It's open to interpretation.
Right. So we need to balance the thrill of these ideas with, the need for solid evidence.
Exactly, like those erosion patterns on the Sphinx. Yeah, they could point to a massive flood, but there are other possible explanations too. And while there are, some intriguing similarities between ancient cultures, attributing them solely to a lost civilization wiped out by a pole shift, that's a pretty big leap.
So the lost civilization theory, while intriguing, needs more to stand on solid ground. What about the mechanics of a pole shift? How does Dr. Thomas explain how this dramatic event unfolds?
He goes deep into the Earth's structure, focusing on that, remember, gooey layer about 60 miles below the surface. It's like the Earth is a peach, right? The skin is the crust, the part we live on. The fleshy part is the mantle. And deep inside that mantle, there's this gooey layer. Dr. Thomas believed that disruptions in the Earth's magnetic and electric fields caused this layer to become even more fluid,
So he's picturing this layer almost like a lubricant between the crust and the rest of the Earth's interior.
Exactly.
Then what? How does that lead to a pole shift?
He proposes that the weight of the ice caps at the poles, it acts like a giant lever, pulling on the crust, which is now sitting on this more fluid layer. And this, he suggests, is what triggers the rapid shift, sending the poles, hurtling towards the equator.
It's a pretty wild concept.
Yeah.
But does it hold up scientifically?
That's where things get a little, well, tricky. While Dr. Thomas, he draws on real scientific concepts, like the Earth's molten core and the magnetic field. His theory about the ice caps acting as a trigger for a sudden pole shift, that's where most scientists disagree.
So the idea of a sudden cataclysmic shift, that's the main point of contention.
Right.
What does the scientific community generally agree on when it comes to pole shifts?
Well, the current consensus is that pole shifts happen gradually, over extremely long periods. We're talking thousands or even millions of years. This idea of a sudden shift, like within a matter of days, like Dr. Thomas describes, it just doesn't align with most of the geological evidence we have.
So while the speed of these events is debated, the concept of pole shifts themselves isn't totally dismissed by science. It seems like Dr. Thomas might have been onto something, even if his timeline is a bit off. But even if these sudden cataclysmic pole shifts aren't likely, the idea that the Earth's magnetic field is weakening and that we might be due for a pole reversal, that's a real thing, right?
Yeah, it is a real thing.
So where does that leave us with Dr. Thomas's work? I mean, how is he seen in the scientific community? Is he like a visionary ahead of his time, or were his ideas just dismissed as, pure speculation?
Well, when his book first came out back in '66, it definitely got its fair share of skepticism, to put it mildly. And to be honest, that skepticism, it still exists today in mainstream science.
Yeah, I can see why. I mean, his claims are pretty out there. But what are the main reasons for this skepticism? Is it just because his ideas are so radical? Or are there, like, fundamental flaws that scientists have pointed out?
It's kind of both, really. For one, his idea that pole shifts happen suddenly, like catastrophically, within days, that clashes with all the geological evidence we have.
So the speed, the time frame he proposes is a major sticking point. What about his explanation for how these shifts actually happen? He talks about disruptions in Earth's magnetic and electric fields, causing the crust to become unstable and slide around. Is there any scientific basis for that?
Well, we know the Earth's magnetic field is dynamic, yeah, and it definitely plays a role in the planet's internal processes. But the thing is, Thomas doesn't really explain how those disruptions would cause the kind of rapid crustal displacement he's talking about.
So that part's a bit fuzzy.
And his idea about the weight of the ice caps acting as a lever to pull the crust, that's also a bit problematic. The ice caps, yeah, they exert some gravitational force, sure, but it's just not nearly enough to cause a sudden pole shift like he describes.
Okay, so the scientific community isn't convinced about the, doomsday pole shift scenario.
Yeah?
But are there any parts of his work that have, stood the test of time? Are there aspects of his theory that actually align with what we understand about Earth today?
There are. For example, Thomas really emphasizes the role of global floods in shaping Earth's history. And as we talked about earlier, recent archaeological discoveries, they've actually provided more evidence that massive floods did happen in the past, and possibly even within the timeframes that he suggested.
Right. We talked about the evidence of that great flood in China and the flooding in the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. It's kind of amazing that some of these discoveries came after his book was published.
It is. It adds a whole new dimension to his work. It makes you wonder if maybe he was tapping into something, even if his overall theory about sudden pole shifts isn't widely accepted. And, it's worth remembering that some of the ideas he presents, like the concept of Earth's crustal displacement, those were initially proposed by well-respected scientists like Charles Hapgood, who we mentioned earlier.
So he wasn't just pulling these ideas out of thin air. He was building on, existing scientific thought, even if he took it in a direction that a lot of scientists weren't ready for. But what about the, let's say, more speculative parts of his work, like the lost civilizations, those ancient connections between cultures? Is there any scientific basis for those claims?
Well, that's where we have to be careful. It's super fascinating to consider these possibilities, but the evidence, it's mostly circumstantial. It's open to interpretation, like those erosion patterns on the Sphinx, for example. They could point to a massive flood, sure, but there are other explanations too.
So multiple interpretations are possible. What about the similarities we see between, ancient myths and different cultures? Could those be evidence of a shared origin, a connection to a lost civilization, like Dr. Thomas suggests?
While those similarities are definitely interesting, to say they're solely because of a shared origin from a lost civilization, a civilization that was wiped out by a pole shift, that's a big jump,
Yeah.
We have to consider other explanations, like cultural diffusion, Or maybe just the fact that humans tend to create similar stories and archetypes across different cultures.
That makes sense. So the lost civilization theory, while it's a great story, it needs more evidence to be considered scientifically valid. Let's switch gears a bit. Let's talk about something we know for sure. The Earth's magnetic field is weakening, and we're likely due for a pole reversal at some point. This is something that scientists are taking seriously, right?
Absolutely. We have tons of evidence that the Earth's magnetic field fluctuates, and that the poles have reversed multiple times throughout history. And right now, observations show the field is weakening. The poles are drifting faster than usual. It suggests we might be headed towards a reversal.
And we talked about the potential consequences of that, right? Disruptions to technology, increased radiation exposure, even potential problems for animals that use the magnetic field to navigate.
Right. It's not an apocalyptic scenario like a sudden pole shift, but it's definitely something we need to be prepared for.
It highlights the fact that we live on a dynamic planet, and even small changes in Earth's systems can have a big impact on us and our technology. So I guess the takeaway here is, while we probably don't need to lose sleep over a sudden pole shift wiping us out, we should definitely be paying attention to the science, understanding the risks, and taking steps to make our infrastructure and technology more resilient.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, right?
This deep dive into Dr. Thomas's theories has been a wild ride, full of mind-blowing possibilities and some healthy skepticism. We've explored lost civilizations, ancient cataclysms, all while trying to stay grounded in the science and, critical thinking. Whether you're on board with Dr. Thomas's ideas or not, one thing's for sure, our planet is constantly changing, and understanding how it works is essential for our future. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep those minds curious, folks, and we'll see you next time.